As businesses around the world buckle in and brace themselves for the impact that the coronavirus pandemic will have on their operations, proper crisis management has become a necessity for company leadership. Yet only 54% of companies have a crisis plan in place. One of the most important actions that business leaders can take in the event of a global crisis event like COVID-19 is to quickly implement a plan to communicate company-wide updates. That's why Beekeeper prepared a general list of internal communication tips to help you effectively communicate with your team during a crisis situation. Download Beekeeper's free crisis communications checklist today at www.beekeeper.io/crisisavertedpodcast. That's www.beekeeper.io/crisisavertedpodcast. Welcome to the Crisis Averted Podcast, produced by CJ Media Solutions. I'm your host, CJ Arlotta. In this episode, I speak with Dave Sobel, host of the Business of Tech podcast. During our conversation, he shares how being a well-rounded individual in your industry can increase your value over time and stresses the importance of practicing and honing skills outside your comfort zone. Feel free to send me your feedback at cj@cjmediasolutionsllc.com. Oh, and if you're listening to the Crisis Averted podcast on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating, review, or both. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Dave, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, CJ.
So for listeners who aren't familiar with you, Dave, mind tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So, I always start this story by saying, I swear I have a computer science degree. I'm an engineer. Because for a guy who ends up riffing, and now I guess I'm sort of doing journalism, it's such a weird background that I swear I'm an engineer. I started my career thinking I was going to be a software developer and did a bunch of consulting, as a start. And I wrote a couple of startups up and down in the late 90s, and that was a great time for an IT guy. And when one of them finally the last one, drove straight into the wall, I kind of noticed that the engineering types like me were the ones that were losing our jobs, but the leadership and sales folks weren't. I said, I'm going to learn from that. I bet I can run a company into a wall just as good as those guys could.
Right.
And that was how I started my MSP, and that's a managed services provider. And what I was focused on was the idea of delivering IT services to small businesses. It was a great story. It was a super great ride. That's actually where you and I met when I was doing my MSP thing. So I was a small business owner delivering IT services there, grew that business from just me to a staff of 14 or 15 at its biggest, $1.5 million in revenue or so. And then I did that for about 10 years, and I had the opportunity to sell. And the way I always described that was it was a great sale, but I needed a job the next day. I'll love it in retirement when that is banked and paid off, and it has made me a bunch of money, but I needed a job the next day. And so I went off and I started working for software vendors that served guys like me because I wanted to learn more about that IT services delivery holistically. So I worked for two different companies, and I went through a couple. We sold one, and then we sold another. The second one I was at, we sold, and then the buyer. I went through the IPO process. It was a whole kind of 8-year journey of that. And by the time I ended up at a big company, I felt like I learned what I wanted to. And that was a year and change ago. And I looked around and said, okay, ready for the next adventure. What am I up to? And I looked at the space and I said, it's a maturing space. And I really think there's a missing editorial voice. Somebody willing to criticize things who's built a financial model where it's okay to criticize, and I'm not going to take a damage on marketing or on sales leads or something like that, where actually I could serve the listener directly. And that was what I wanted to do, and that's why I launched my MSP Radio as the company name, and the Business of Tech is my flagship podcast, which is a daily 5-minute news and commentary show focused on guys like me, the IT solution provider, the guy delivering IT services. I want to make their business better, and that's what I'm doing now.
So what's your model with Business of Tech? You mentioned that you wanted to be out there willing to criticize things that you're seeing in the industry and not having to worry about, taking a blow, whether it comes to advertising and whatnot. So how does your business model work? Is it different from traditional publications?
Yeah, and so the answer is I kind of embrace the new media independent journalist style model, where somebody goes out independently and has a direct relationship with their audience. I always start with my favorite way to make money is that I get direct supporters. I actually am supported by Patreon, if you're familiar with the service.
Hmm.
Lots of podcasters, video game guys, creatives use it. Literally, I just have people that I call it my give what you want model. They sign up for what they think it's worth, and it dings their credit card. And every month, I get a money from my supporters. I love that model because it means that I directly work for the listeners. People give what they think what their value is. I kind of always laugh and go, I hope I'm delivering a ton of value, giving you like a ways of making money, and then you remember me when on the ding of the credit card. That also gives me a really engaged subgroup of the audience that I can poll, that they get early access to some of the content. When I do editorials, it goes to them first. If I'm bouncing an idea around, I ask my Patreons, when I'm thinking about something or I have a question. So it's a great audience engagement tool. I freely admit I sell ads. Another portion of my revenue stream is that I sell ads. I'm pushing back a little bit on the idea of sponsored content or content marketing. I kind of laugh and go, sometimes you just want to say your 30-second ad, right? Like you're a company and you want to give your pitch, and all you need is 30 seconds. You don't want to wrap it in a 45-minute garbage webinar where I hide the message, right? And I have to get some speaker on, and I
Right.
kind of have like
And
sometimes
everybody knows that you're trying to hide the message too, right?
exactly. So I just tell my sponsors is like, look, just tell your 30 seconds. I'll do the heavy lifting on making sure people are listening to good content that's valuable every day. You just include your stuff. And I only include it's one ad spot in the podcast. So it's simple, little 30-second bit. And everybody knows, look, that's how the bills get paid. And then the final bit is I freely admit I do some consulting, for organizations that need an independent assessment. I provide opinions for hire. So, but sometimes they want to have a private conversation, particularly like large software vendors or these IT solution providers will say, we want to have a private conversation. We've heard your public opinions. I laugh and go, my public and private opinions are the same, but they want to reveal certain different details about their business and get my comments on that, and I'm happy to provide that. So that's the way I've diversified the revenue so that I serve speaking for the audience.
Have you any issues with conflict with people that you're consulting with and the vendors that you're reporting on in the industry?
No, because the nice thing about it is that I'm delivering that independent advice. I'm not taking any jobs where I'm tied to the delivery, or that I'm selling my audience. What I'm selling is my perspective. I come in there and say, like, look, I have thousands of listeners. I talk to MSPs and IT guys all day long. I am happy to give you my opinion. And as everybody knows, sometimes you want to provide opinions on things that are more confidential. I'm happy to do that. So I keep it to that level of engagement, and thus I'm not getting myself into a conflict. I really think a lot about the fact that I want to be doing this for a while, right? And so the most valuable thing that I've got is my credibility. I don't want to sell that in a short-term consulting deal and sacrifice the long-term investment.
What were some of the biggest challenges you faced when starting the business of tech?
It was figuring out a little bit of this balance. It's funny because I'm not a journalist, right? Like I wear the title now awkwardly. Because I still think of myself as an IT guy. Like I still think of myself as the guy delivering services, and now I'm asking the harder questions in a way that I used to when I was the customer, but with a different thinking to it. So for me, figuring out that balance of where the voice was the first big challenge. And then the second part of that was figuring out a way that I could build this really sustainably and get it to a point where I could do this knowing it had a long-term future and a rhythm of delivery. So I think those were the two areas where I spent the most time figuring it out.
But you always had a voice in industry, right? That was difficult for you to find out.
Well, it's so what's interesting is I mean, look, I've always been a loudmouth, right? Like I freely admit
That's not how I put it, Dave. But
but I'm self-aware. I'm totally self-aware, and I own it, right? And what's interesting is that it's kind of a return to my roots a little bit. I was a loudmouth when I was my own business owner, right? And everybody knew it, right? I always shut off my mouth, and I was happy to say what was on my mind. And then I went and worked for software vendors, and the joy of that is when you've got a really good alignment between the employer and you can speak very genuinely, and it be exactly who you are, and you're nice and in alignment with your employer. That is, as anybody who knows, in a big organization, that's just harder when you've got, like, the larger the organization gets, the more difficult it is to keep that alignment. And that, I mean, that's why guys like you at times, like, will do media training, right? Like, you teach people to do that, to speak both personally and for the company. I think that's a really valuable skill, and I don't ever think badly of people with that. I mean, I did it, right? But you also then have to unwind some of that too when you go back to, I'm just speaking for me.
right.
I don't have to think about I was left the corporate overlord. I don't have to align that anymore. That's not a good or a bad thing. It just is a thing, and the voices are different, and that is something that you think about. So I've moved into that category as well.
It works for you with Business of Tech. It works so well because you have the tech side that you know very well. You have the business side, the operations side, and you're able to communicate that. Which all of those, that skill set is very rare in in the tech space, as you know. So how did you kind of develop all of that? Have you always just been that way?
It's both yes, and you've worked on it. Like, it's so. I look at this and say, like, I am the product of my career and my time investments. I smile and go, I have a computer science degree, right? So I invested in being an engineer. But I'll also observe, I went to a liberal arts school. I didn't go to an engineering school. I went to the College of William and Mary in Virginia. I'm very proud of that. While it's a Bachelor of Science, it's from a liberal arts school. Like, I had to take writing classes. I had to invest time in doing that. Now, I freely admit I'm a social guy. I'm not necessarily your typical engineer type, but you also have to practice those skills, and you have to value them. When I started my first business, when I started the MSP, I would never have said I was a business person. Fail fast. I made so many mistakes. Like, I have an epic saga of, like, completely screwing up an acquisition. We bought another software or another services company, and I lost so much money. I lost piles of money on that deal. But you learn, right? You learn, and you get better at these things, and you refine it over time. Then the reason I took those jobs as a software vendor was not because I thought I knew everything. It's because I knew I didn't. And anybody who's familiar with this space, and we've worked together in this space, but I'll abstract it. Like, oftentimes someone will say, like, well, I did this one thing, that means I'm an expert forever. And I was really sort of self-aware to go, no, I did this one thing. Maybe I really ought to get better at the other things before I say, like, I know what I'm talking about. And that's why I went to work for software vendors, was because I wanted to learn the skills that they had that I didn't. And it was also an opportunity to work with guys like me at scale, which I'd never done. I worked with me, and I had peers, but I'd never worked at scale where I was thinking about hundreds and thousands of them at the same time. And so it just keeps refining. And here I am, in my mid-40s with a skill set where you're sort of right. It's like, yeah, I've got kind of a unique skill set, and now I found a new way to apply that.
And you've brought this up on the Business of Tech podcast before multiple times about where people should question where that information is coming from, who's it coming from, what other motives they may have. Is it based on data or opinion? Or are you seeing a lot of that, and that's why that's a topic that you bring up often?
Yeah, well, so it's like, I could link it to, like, the current cultural environment, but I'll actually be very business-like on this and say I've always been super data-driven. And the reason for that is that, like, I love to go, everybody's got an opinion. Mm-hmm. there's a crude saying that goes along with that, right? Like it's everyone's got an opinion,
Right.
right? But all opinions are not created equal. I work with, the reason I like experts is because I know I don't know everything. So I seek out somebody who has expertise, and I know that I am better when I surround myself with people that know things that I don't, and that I have experts that I can rely on. I've always been in my best zone with that, right? And so I rely on data. This was reinforced for me working for at one of those software vendor jobs where my CEO had this quip, and he always said, "My data beats your opinion every time."
Right. That's good.
Right, it's
Yeah,
totally good.
that's
And
good.
so I learned real fast. I was like, "Oh, I better have data. Like, I better always have data, because if his data beats my opinion, the only way to beat his data is better data."
Mhm. Yeah.
and so I've always known, like, since then it's like I gotta have data on hand to make a decision based off of. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm locked in forever in a particular opinion, or I'm not willing to change direction, or I'm not willing to be influenced by new sources, right? Because I can't know everything, and I can't know all the data. But opinions are one thing, but experts coming based on data and testing and experience, that's something that I really treasure. But I also push a little bit back against this idea that you can't have an opinion, particularly in like the space, quote unquote, I'm putting journalism in quotes, right? Like, it's why I like to think of myself more as an analyst versus a journalist.
Sure.
Is I'm providing insight and information based off of a bunch of data that I have processed that I like to present. Oh, and by the way, my lens of expertise. I think you should understand that. And I also think you ought to understand, like, I'm really open about the way that I make money, because I think people ought to understand that. It's not a good or bad thing. It's a thing. And you analyze those sources to make your own decision based on those inputs. I just like to be super transparent about it.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and I think your model is an interesting one, and you're seeing a lot of publications go that route, especially individual journalists or analysts, where you are getting kind of a subscription model, or some sort of a payment from the readers or listeners, especially with a lot that's going on in society with cancel culture and whatnot, and worried about advertisers. So that's kind of an interesting part to your revenue model as well.
Yeah, and that's the idea, is to keep me close. And look, I freely admit, you kind of always laugh and go, like, I'm also slightly paranoid, right? As a business owner, you always diversify your revenue streams,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
many ways as you can possibly do it.
Mhm.
So you think about the way that I make money. It's like I have several sources, and they are several sources that each component has several, lots of different bits to it. And so it allows me to take more of a risk, be a little bit bolder with the opinions, knowing that I've got that ability to, if somebody gets mad at me for the wrong reasons, right, then you've got a way of dealing with it. I think we need to be more open to controversial ideas without making it personal. I want to have conversations about ideas without attacking somebody's own person. First off, I don't think it's very much fun. Like, I don't think it's fun to, like, attack people or be mean or that kind of thing.
And it doesn't
People are,
move the conversation at all either.
yeah,
Yeah.
people, and look, I'm a generally optimistic kind of guy, despite my gloom and doom sometime about the market on my podcast, right?
Yeah.
Either the market or cybersecurity, right? The two
Right.
things I'm always gloom and doom about. But I'm generally an optimistic guy, and it comes from, like, I love to travel, for example, and I always say that I love to travel because most people, when you meet them, are really just nice, right? Like, most people, they'll smile. And if you go somewhere and you ask them about, like, their food or their drink or their city, they are, like, so proud to show it off. And if you're just open to that, it's so much fun. And so I look and say, like, the people aren't the problem. We just have to have conversations about ideas and about direction and data and perform. Like, that's separate from people, though. And I like to separate the two out, and that way we can have, like, good rough and tumble intellectual idea conversations, what I think is super valuable, separating out from who the people are.
Do you miss traveling at all? Do you enjoy going on the webinars and all the virtual conferences that have popped up? Or are you kind of webinared out?
Well, so it's a really interesting question. So when I left my last corporate job, I had just rolled over 1 million air miles, with United. Uh, so yeah, and
Wow.
exactly I'm a million miler with United. I am lifetime platinum with Marriott. Like I've got all the road warrior stats. And what I realized was that I had hit a point where two statements were simultaneously true. I do love to travel and see places and get out there, but I was totally done with having the same conversation over and over and over again in Marriott bars around the world.
Yeah.
like
Right.
like
Right.
and so I was done with that mentally pre-COVID, saying, you know what, I do love to travel, but I want it to matter. Like I want it to make a difference. I don't want to do the same thing over and over again. And I need to be careful and selective about where that time is spent and not just do it. And for me, I thought a lot about that. And that's why I said, you know what, I can get into podcasting, I can get into videos, I can do this kind of stuff because I can do it at a much more interesting scale and then be really deliberate about the places that I go and not have to do like the same grind. And then of course COVID hit and I was sort of right into do it ready, like you look and say like, well, I had the business totally ready for a pandemic
Yeah.
because I was already ready to be off the road.
Right.
Do I miss travel? Yeah, I'm really looking forward to like going to a concert or a ball game or like exploring restaurants of the world and like I want to go somewhere warm like for like those kinds of things. Do I miss the grind of it? No, not really, because I want to do something else, and I want to make sure that I'm doing something a little bit more impactful for me.
Did you have to shift much during the COVID-19 pandemic with everything that you're doing right now? I know you mentioned that your kind of business was set up for a pandemic in a way, but did you have to shift in any areas, and whether it's revenue topics?
Well, so I had some physical consulting and speaking stuff that all dried up.
Yeah,
so there
you
was
sure.
that, like so because in the pre version of this, I was still doing some speaking and conference style stuff. I could just be a little bit more selective. Now, of course, that all went away.
Yeah.
But some of it then, as those vendors and such retooled, that restarted as the virtual stuff. So there was a bit of a pivot in there. What was interesting actually for me was it was less about the fact that that I wasn't ready for it, is that they weren't ready for me. In that there was so many, I was trying something new before people were ready for it. Then there was the shift, and there was a lot of rebalancing going on, like in marketing departments and habits. And I laugh and go, and my own podcast listenership got thrown off because people stopped being in cars.
Mm,
So like I was
right.
part of a routine, and then all of a sudden I wasn't.
Yeah.
So I had to I had to reestablish a little bit during that March timeframe. But from an execution perspective, it stayed pretty consistent.
How did you adapt to that? That's interesting. The routine that you're saying, you knew a lot of your listeners were listening to you while they were on their way to work. So what did you do to kind of change that up?
Um, it was making sure that I was relevant to the time. The joy of the joy and curse of what I'm doing from a production perspective is a daily 5-minute podcast talking about news and events means you're producing a daily podcast every day.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that is a machine that has to get fed, right?
That's why I only do this once a week.
Right. It's a machine that has to get fed. Now
Right.
I'm lucky in the fact that I am an avid news consumer anyway, right? You can always say, by the way that I was talking about it, because I'm constantly looking for data anyway, I already geek out on analyzing this stuff. Now I just get to put my thoughts together in 5 minutes. But for in answer to that, what I had to do was some pivoting to make sure that I was relevant to what people needed at the time. So, for example, I did a lot of, if people go back and listen to some of those late March shows, I would do like a coronavirus roundup every day because news was moving really fast, and I wanted to make sure to cover the stuff people might need to know, particularly as it related to technology. That's, of course, that piece has gone away from the show. So I find that for me, it's about being adaptable to themes and topics that I think are relevant for people in that timely manner. Because I am a rapid production show, I have the ability to be really versatile on that. The only structure, of course, is that I'm shooting for 5 minutes and roughly three to four stories a day. But besides that, I can do with the time what I think is most relevant. And so the trick was being agile with the content.
How do you go about searching for your news? What type of, I'm sure you're using different apps and whatnot. Are you using Feedly? Are you using Google Alerts? What do you do to really pull together that news?
Yes, yes, and yes. So if we're getting into like the mechanics of it
Yes,
a little bit, just
let's
to
do
give
it.
some, yeah. So I'm on a bunch of newsletters, right? So I do a bunch of newsletter reading every morning. I will say that I actually make sure to do a little bit of working out and listen to some podcasts before I even open my email. And the reason, and generally the podcasts I'm listening to are intended to be like the big thinking stuff, so that I do that first thing in the morning so that I don't get locked into like some particular news story too fast.
Now, the podcast, just to interrupt you real quick, the
Yeah.
podcast you do listen to when it comes to big thinking, is it big thinking in the tech space? Is it big thinking business wise? Is it a mix?
It's a mix. It's a mix of the two. So, I mean, I freely admit I'm a fanboy for Professor Scott Galloway. I
Sure.
love his stuff. I listen to Kara Swisher. Like they do Pivot together, and I listen to a couple of her podcasts. Listen to the people like the Verge Cast. I do the Tech Me Bride Home. Like I've got a couple of different ones that I get this thinking. I'm a bit of a political junkie too, so I listen to one or two of those just to like know what's going on in the world. But I'm trying to get these longer form stuff in the morning so that it's not just like a list of news stories, because I want to open my brain up to the way that'll work. Then it's a bunch of newsletters to clear out my morning. Everybody likes to send their newsletter in the morning, so it's a great time to get caught up on a bunch of news. Then I'm starting to dig into a massive list of RSS and Google alerts that are all tied together I use NetNewsWire, but it's Feedly on the back end, so that I'm scanning all of this stuff, looking for patterns and looking for stories that matter to me. Because I like to say it's the two ways, because I like to see like, okay, 5 outlets covered this, that thus has a relative importance. And I'm also looking for like, okay, that one's interesting to me, or that one's interesting to me. And I'm trying to make sure that I'm not on the same path. I have a bunch of Google alerts on phrases and stuff that are interesting to me and thematic to what I'm doing. And then I pull it all together and I open all of these articles and a bunch of tabs in my browser, and then I reorganize them to group them by type to say like, okay, do I see the pattern? Do I see the emergence? Then I try and cross-reference to my long-term data sources. So, for example, like anytime somebody's publishing a report, I throw that into Evernote so that I can then search for it again later. So I have tons of those. Anybody likes to publish a report, that PDF went into my Evernote somewhere so that I can find it again. And then I pull it all together and I start opening the Word document template that I have, and I start saying, okay, what are the 3 that are making today's cut?
Do you plan on doing more longer form stuff? I mean, you mentioned before that you kind of try to get the big ideas right in the morning. And I'm kind of a mix with that myself. I listen to different podcasts. Sometimes, I'll listen to a political podcast just to kind of see what's kind of going on there. But I'm always big I love listening to longer form podcasts. I'm a big, Joe Rogan fan, and I'm not sitting there
Right.
sometimes listening to all 3 hours, but I like just a longer form podcast where you get to ask deeper questions, right? My questions are usually different depending on if my conversation is going to be 30 minutes or an hour or an hour and a half. So I'm always switching it up. So do you see yourself changing into a longer form? Is that in your plans anywhere?
So I actually do some of those long form pieces now. And what I do them is I do them what I call my weekend bonus episodes. On a 5-minute daily podcast, that's, the 5 business days or whatever business days are, because I do occasionally, I take the vacation just like everybody else, for example, on Thanksgiving or the day after. But those are the 5 business days I've committed to. That leaves me 2 extra slots, and I can do something for the Saturday and Sunday release episodes where I can do something long form. Generally, they fall into one of 2 categories. Either it will be where just like you, I want to have a conversation with somebody, or I want to interview. So I've had some conversations. I wanted to interview the Louisiana Secretary of State when he was talking about the legislation for.
That was a really good interview, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's where one I get interested in, right? Like it's somebody that I want to talk to about a story. Then the other piece that I will do is sometimes, when I have something on my mind and I want to do what would be the equivalent of an editorial piece, that also does that. So I've made space there for both issues that I think are relevant to solution providers or issues I think need to be addressed. For example, when Microsoft made a big announcement, I had some editorial thoughts on what that meant for the industry. I did that as a release piece. I've also covered some of the diversity issues in the IT space, being such a white male space, and I wanted to provide some metrics and insight, so I did a piece on that. I just did one on the 2020 election, and from the perspective of let's actually talk about the laws that happened that aren't the presidential race. Like there's a bunch of smaller local laws, state level laws that from a technology perspective are really important. So I use the weekend pieces for those.
I want to just go off of something you just said about state and local laws, which definitely for this space, interesting to look into. But I think we're always used to looking at the federal level and the presidential race and what's going on there. But with the pandemic, I think a lot of people have realized that a lot of different laws and a lot of changes were made at the state and local levels, and they're starting to realize how quickly things can change overnight depending on what's going on in their particular state and their locality. And I think people are really starting to pay attention to the elected officials at those 2 different levels. Do you also see that in the tech space when you're talking with business owners, that they're paying a little bit more attention to some of the issues that are going on at the state and local levels?
So the way you ask that is a little bit more, yes. Enough, I'm going to say no.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, it's actually, so this is, for me, this is actually one of those areas where it is, call it my own personal crusade on this.
Yeah.
When I thought about what needed to be covered in our space, the thinking about small business, what needed to be addressed from an IT perspective, I don't want to talk about vendor programs anymore. I want to talk about these things, like what you actually need to know to get your job done.
Right.
And that is things like, I don't know, what laws apply to you right now? And what do those laws mean? And how are legislators getting involved in our space? And maybe we ought to be involved in that too. And all of those issues. And I have to say, to a certain degree, I laugh and always go, well, clearly the large software vendors in the space aren't going to pay me to do this. So I'm going to have to do it direct to audience. Right?
Right.
Right. I mean, look, and that's why I kind of laugh and go, there's some really great stuff going on covering the IT industry, particularly as it relates to small companies. But this just feels like a blind spot. And I was like, well, okay, I'll just take it on. I may not be, I don't know if I'm any good at it, but I'm going to try. and I'll come at it from again, my data-driven perspective of I'll do my best research. I'll dig into this. I will start reporting. And by the way, this is a conversation with my audience. Here's where I'm getting, this is my information I've got. Hey, if I'm wrong, if I'm missing something, speak up. Let's work on this together, right? Because you're directly how I'm making money, audience. I'm here to serve you. So you're exactly right. I think this is an area that has growing interest, but I don't think it's enough. And I think it really should be, because I keep looking at this, and the more I learn, the more I keep going, there is really both risk and reward here.
Mm-hmm.
If I dig into, I'll just pull one, right? My current favorite, I've got 2, but I'll pull the top one. In Denver, voters opted out of the law prohibiting the use of tax dollars to build a municipal internet. This is that, those laws that normally generally mean that you'll have like a monopoly or a duopoly from like the cable provider or the telephone provider or something along those lines. And Denver has said, nah, we're going to allow our own internet. Like, we're going to build a city. We might build a municipal one. That's like super interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because this is a great, like, this is a local thing. Like, if Denver rolls out its own municipal internet, that opens up a ton of business possibilities from a technology perspective. Really interesting. There was a referendum in Chicago. 90% of voters believe internet access should be a public utility. 90%. Find me another issue that like 90% of
right.
right will agree on. But 90% of voters agreed that internet access should be a public utility. Like, these are conversations we should be having as technologists, as small business people, and I want to have those conversations. So for me, it's a lot of that stuff.
What do these MSPs, these managed service providers, need to do to understand all of this? With all this, I mean, you already know that they, looking for the legislation that's out there and paying attention to these new laws, especially when it comes to cybersecurity and privacy. How are they going to stay on top of that and pay attention to everything that's going on, and then also provide the services that they've been contracted to provide? Do they need to, pay more in legal fees and have somebody on full time to pay attention to this? I mean, is there a solution?
Well, I have to laugh and go like, yeah, it's really hard.
Yeah.
And by the way, like, I say that like flippantly, but I'm also trying to make a point.
Yeah.
Like, in that this industry is getting a lot harder than it was before.
Right.
And it's comforting for us to have these conversations and say, oh, well, we should all, there's so much opportunity. There's so much that we can do here. Yeah, because it's hard. Like, and that may mean that we're going to have you're going to have to look at your business plan. You're going to have to look at the way you're investing. Maybe your rates aren't high enough, right? Like, maybe you're not charging enough truly based on the value of the services that you're doing. Maybe you're not hiring the right people. Maybe we need less system administrators and more policy writers. Mm-hmm. Trainers, people that are tracking all of this. Maybe you need to be much more in concert with the legal profession. Like, maybe you ought to be partnering with law offices and working closely with regulators or with insurance agents or with those different skill sets. There's a tendency by technologists and IT people to over-rotate on technology and tools. Mm-hmm. When I look at it from a like profit and loss perspective, and hey, all you small business owners like that are dealing with an IT guy, I'm going to give you a secret away. The amount of money that a typical IT solution provider spends on their tools is a far smaller percentage, like dramatically so, than what they spend on their labor. Like, keeping your people engaged in the right stuff and not over-rotated on the technology, yet still delivering technology services. Like, your mix of spend on labor matters so much more than your mix of spend on tools. But we spend so much time talking about tools.
Yeah.
It's like, let's stop talking about tools, because as far as I can tell, the only people that are truly benefiting from having all of these conversations about the tools are the software vendors. It's not actually really helping drive a solution provider, an MSP, an IT services company. It doesn't really help their bottom line, not nearly as much as like the diversity of your labor pool, like the people that work for you and what their skill sets are, and are you selling them at the proper rates and at a proper profitability. Like, talking about that stuff, that moves the needle.
Right. Is there going to be a wake-up call for MSPs when it comes to this, though? Has there already been? I mean, and then also with their clients and the small business owners, is there going to be a time where they're going to wake up and realize, hey, it's way more about it's less about the technology and some of this other stuff that you really need to deal with when it comes to cybersecurity threats. And you're seeing that MSPs are You're always seeing the news of MSPs being hacked and whatnot. So when does that conversation become bigger? Is it really just an education that the MSPs have to go out there with the small business owners and really educate them on this topic? But then they also have to understand that it is a bigger topic than just the tech aspect.
Well, so I'll smile and go, well, it's already happened.
Yeah.
We're well beyond the tipping point on this one.
Yeah.
And so is there a moment? No. That's actually the reason why this is important to have the conversations, because it's not a single moment. This is the theoretical death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
How many IT people have been dealing with their insurance rates going up 3, 4, 5, 10 times, or being unable to get E&O insurance because of their business? Like, that's one of the cuts, right? Regulation is coming in terms of the fact that the guy who cuts my hair is more regulated than the guy that backs up and manages the entire data set for my entire business.
Right.
Something's broken there. like I'm just going to observe that ain't right. Right. And again, think about this from a political perspective. Doesn't matter what side of the aisle you are on this one, red or blue. A really good way to get people to vote for you is say, I'm going to protect small business. Mm-hmm. And what am I going to do? I'm going to look at this computer space where there's all these cyber gangs, like, as I described, like, say, literally, let me make the analogy here. Armed gangs of criminals are breaking into businesses and they are holding hostages. Everything I just said is true.
Right.
If it was happening in the physical world, can you imagine the calls for policing and for that would be happening? Right. But this is happening every single day in businesses. And small business owners are going to start looking up going, what do you mean all the people that are helping here have like no credentials or no testing, or we don't know who they are? They can just, anybody can do this. What do you mean that's true? Something's going to change. It's a winning political issue. And so I look at this and say, like, all of these factors are going to come together, but is it going to happen in a single moment? Oh, no. Oh, it doesn't happen that way. It happens very over time. And this is where I look and say, like, look, savvy solution providers, you can see all of this coming. It's time to get ahead of it, because it won't happen in a moment. It will happen over time.
Last question on this topic, and then we'll start wrapping things up. But should MSPs want more regulation? And if so, should they be the ones kind of out there trying to promote that regulation? So, the elected officials have the insight from the MSPs instead of elected officials who know nothing about the space creating laws on the space. What are your thoughts on that?
You've hit the key point. The question isn't, do they want regulation or not? You don't get a choice. Right. It's happening. Regulations happen. By the way, it's already passed in Louisiana. If you think that's the last law and you don't think they're done regulating, oh, you have not been paying attention.
Right.
Like, you don't get to choose regulation or no regulation. All that's on the table anymore is, what is that regulation going to look like? Mm-hmm. And for anybody that says that, my favorite answer on this is always the really smart, really savvy IT guy that says, oh, I don't have to worry. I'm going to be way better than any regulation they write. And I always smile and I go, yeah, but what if they write the regulation wrong because you weren't involved?
Right.
Now you have to go do a bunch of stuff that makes no sense because you weren't at the table helping get the regulation written. Mm-hmm. So I look at this and say, you absolutely want to start figuring out how we come together. Generally, I think at the state level in the U.S., to help lawmakers write this kind of regulation, because you want it to be right and we want it to come from industry so it is as close to reasonable as possible, right? And it is actually something that helps the industry, not hurts it.
And last question for you, Dave, today. What are some of your goals for 2021, as a business owner?
Have some fun.
And we're done with the podcast. So thank you for joining me today.
Yeah. So the actual measurement for me is like, do I help a bunch of businesses?
Yeah.
If I can make it, one of the interesting thing for me is that I've asked some questions, and it's been very gratifying that topics on the show are starting to make a difference to the way the industry is talking or engaging. I made some changes on the way lobbying is done around right to repair. Like that, I can track that. I can track the influence and conversation that we've had around MSP regulation. I broke some of that story, not alone, but I broke some of that story, and people were able to get up to speed on it because of stuff that I did. There were some questions that I've asked to vendors that were, I put out some editorial content, and then those vendors were asked those questions by other journalists. It's really gratifying.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Right.
It's gratifying.
But it's really gratifying because it means that what we're talking about, what the audience and the conversation that I'm having with my audience is making a difference. So if I ask about 2021, it's about, I want to do more of that. And I want to be driven as much as possible by what the needs of the community want me to work on. In terms of like, where are the areas that they aren't getting enough information? Because I only have to serve the one master, right? Like I only have to serve what my audience wants. If that's what they want, we'll do more of that.
Yeah.
And if they don't want more of it, then we'll do other stuff. That's the joy of what I'm doing. So when I think about 2021, it's like I want to get more of these issues and continue to have it be a two-way engagement, not just feel like it's me talking. And I love when it is a conversation. When I hear from listeners, I read every single comment. Like everybody makes a comment on a video or emails me or writes something or tweets something. I read it all. And I love that portion of the conversation. So it's just do more of that.
Dave, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it.
CJ, thanks for having me. This has been great fun.